Thank you so much, Pam, for that wonderful introduction. And let me add my warmest welcome to everyone who's here with us in the meeting tonight, and especially to my colleagues um, who have agreed to be part of this conversation this evening. It's really wonderful to have Sue and Tim and Chris here, along with our Dean at Union, Pamela Cooper White. And I want to pick up with what Pam was asking about what is pastoral imagination. Uh, Simple way to think about it to start is that it's three things. It's a concept that we've been working with in the Learning Pastoral Imagination Project, which is the research project about pastoral imagination. And third, it is also now my book. The title of my book is Pastoral Imagination, Bringing the Practice of Ministry to Life. And I want to unpack those three things just a little bit tonight as we kick off this conversation. I was actually trying to think early on about how I would introduce the idea of pastoral imagination, the concept, to you in a way that might resonate. And I was thinking to the fact that my daughter and I have been watching some television together during the pandemic months. And one of the things that we watched recently is the television show, which is sort of like just a long miniseries, one season, called The Queen's Gambit. And in that show, the lead character is Beth Harmon. And Beth is a prodigy and she learns to play chess. But even though she's got a true genius for it and a gift for it, how does she actually learn to play chess? By playing over and over and over. She plays with a mentor. She then starts to go to tournaments and she plays everybody she can. She practices and practices and practices. And not only that, she has to read about it. She learns how other people, chess masters, played the game. She learns their moves and she interacts with, studies the games after they're over to see what the moves were and what was left. And it's a wonderful example of how anything complex like chess or certain instruments, almost all professional practices, even common everyday activities we do like driving or riding a bike, cooking, or parenting, we have to learn by practicing over and over and over. And interesting, Beth Harmon also got a lot of help, even though she tried to do it as kind of an independent person and just trust her own instincts and skills and her own genius. There were times when she couldn't have gotten through without help from friends, help from mentors, people who helped her understand what was happening in a particular game or the game as a whole to level her up to a new playing capacity. That is also like learning any complex practice like ministry. And so have been studying now this complex concept of pastoral imagination. Term first coined by Craig Dykstra in the late 1990s, and others have picked up on and used that idea in their theological education, in other books. But Chris and I decided we wanted to find out how it is that people actually learn and grow in this capacity. How are they able to cultivate the skills, the wisdom, the knowledge, the embodied and relational capacities that make up pastoral imagination? So to do that, we recruited 50 people who were in their final year of seminary. We recruited them from schools all across the country, and 10 different schools, 5 people from each school, and we've been following them now for 10 to 12 years, a kind of a rolling start and then a rolling continuation. We're happy that we've been funded again this year for our 10-year mark of research with each cohort, and that funding came to us from the Louisville Institute. Early on, we were funded by the Lilly Endowment. And it's been a real gift to continue to follow along with all of these people who come from many different walks of life in terms of their denominational background, in terms of their racial and ethnic identities, in terms of their ages, and in terms of then the theological education they received at these 10 different schools. So even though it's a smallish cohort for a longitudinal study of 50 people. We also studied early on, met with, interviewed 25 very advanced ministers, people who've been in ministry at least 25 years or so. And together, all this study that we've been doing, meeting people every couple years, and then most recently, it's been almost 5 years since we've seen most of the cohort. We're learning tremendous insights into what it is to learn in practice, how folks begin to see and become the kind of ministers they feel called to be. Well, what did we do when we wanted to build on Craig Dykstra's idea of pastoral imagination or pastoral intelligence? What we did was connect it with a couple of things. One is the idea of phronesis, which is a concept that was first articulated and written about by Aristotle a couple of thousand more years ago. And he used the word phronesis to express a kind of practical wisdom, wisdom that is only known by doing. It's also not just a practical wisdom, it's also a virtue, the ability to look into a situation and know the right and fitting thing to do. So that kind of capacity to cultivate practical wisdom in any situation, but particularly we're interested in how people cultivate it for ministry. It takes time. It can only be learned over time. It can only be learned by taking risk and then owning responsibility for what happens when one takes a risk. And sometimes that goes wrong, and we need feedback to figure out how to do it better the next time or see more clearly into a situation. We need mentors. We need supportive context in order to begin to see the world and act as people who embody a pastoral imagination. We also, in addition to connecting with phronesis, have also wanted to connect this idea of pastoral imagination to the gifts and the work of the Holy Spirit, because we don't believe it's simply, neither would Aristotle believe it's simply a skill. In fact, it's not just skill, it's a kind of knowing that goes beyond knowledge or skill or even technical know-how and combines all of that into this wise kind of knowing how to be in the world. So through the research project, we began to write a number of articles, and in fact, you can read our 5-year report, which was the point at which we'd interviewed everybody in the study 3 times and had a sense of what it was like to be those first 5 years out of seminary and in ministry, with the caveat that some people who are in our study were already in ministry before they went to seminary. There's not just one pathway that people take. But in that 5-year report, we shared a number of findings, and you can see that, a link to that report in the chat. And that was really written for our colleagues in theological education, like those who are gathered with me here tonight, also with other colleagues in field education especially, and pastoral care, and all the practical theology related disciplines. But it's also written for our colleagues in Bible and history and ethics and the other areas of theological curriculum, because we think the kind of learning that happens in pastoral imagination is really the kind of learning that everybody across the whole curriculum needs in order to become wise religious leaders in what they do. So sharing things that we've written with our colleagues was one thing. But about 3-4 years ago, I decided it was really time for us to get more of what we were learning and our findings out to pastors themselves, not behind paywalls of academic articles or even a big long 65-page report, but how could I put it into brief, topical conversations that would invite people into learning in this way. And so what I did was launch in the December of 2018, 3-Minute Ministry Mentor. And that is a weekly episode of videos and blog, and then the video is also available as a podcast. And it really invites people to think about what it is to learn and practice using the stories of people we gathered in the research and topics we have determined are extremely important for learning and practice. So that comes out each week. That became the core of the book, Pastoral Imagination, which came out in May. And the 50 topics that I shared in the first year are the same as the 50 chapters of the book. And there's a few other things related to where we are with the project now that I want to bring up and put on the table for a bit of conversation. For example, one of the things that I did about 5 years ago, the 5-year report was newly out, and I was invited to a conversation, a weekend retreat with an imam and a rabbi, and then I was the representative of the Christian tradition, having been a minister and then studied ministry. And we were all presenting on how students and new ministers in our traditions learn to practice their leadership as religious, sort of endorsed religious leaders, imams, rabbis, Christian pastors, priests, chaplains, etc., and they're chaplains for all those traditions. And what was really interesting about that is that the people who were there with me that week didn't have the kind of research to draw on that Chris and I have been working on now for all these years. They have a sense about how people learn, but they haven't given it, those particular leaders couldn't identify any place where someone's done a sort of systematic study of how people learn, something like pastoral imagination in practice. But they felt like I had opened a door for them, I think, and they were able to talk about it in one particular way we all found resonance quickly, is that we imagine our students in our various educational institutions being formed by a deep dive in their in the texts, the scriptures of each tradition. And by reading those scriptures, one is shaped and formed in a particular way. I would call that an apprenticeship to the scripture, to the text, to the Quran, to the Hebrew scriptures, or in the case of Christians, the Bible. So that apprenticeship definitely is one that shapes people for their leadership. But what we've learned in the Learning Pastoral Imagination Project is there's so many different kinds of formation. For instance, when we ask in a very first interview with most of these, all these 50 people in the early round, what was an aha moment of learning in ministry for you? Almost none of them gave us an answer that included, I learned something in Professor so-and-so's class. The classroom did not hardly come up in those early days of us asking where the aha moments were. What came up was clinical pastoral education, field education, that summer when they were a camp counselor, or the 2 years they managed a bookstore, or some other part of lived experience. They learned to lead and embody the skills and knowledge and all the rest by doing it, by practicing. And so it's crucial that we dig deeper into what it means to have embodied, relational, and emotional and spiritual capacities that work together in an integrative way, so that when one steps into a situation, one has some sense of how to respond in an appropriate and fitting pastoral way. So that is what the project has been about. The book itself, it's helpful to think about it as perhaps the 50 chapters. You say, wow, what's a book with 50 chapters? They're short, they're brief, and each one focuses on 1, 2, or sometimes 3 stories from the people who are in our study. There are also stories from my own life and experience and my own work as a teacher, which come into play in these chapters. And it's helpful to think about each of these 50 as kind of layers, these 50 topics. And one layer, if you think of a map as layered, in your Google app or one of your apps on your phone, you look at a map, you can see the topography, you can see the streets and roads, you can see perhaps an actual image, like satellite image of the houses and buildings and trees, etc. There's other maps you could imagine, like one that shows the minerals, or one that shows the water flow, or a historical map that shows what used to be there. And so, thinking about these 50 topics, it's good to think about them all as interrelated, about the same thing, but each a discrete layer of how you might begin to understand the work, the learning, the capacity of pastoral imagination. So I'll stop at that point, and we'll see if some of my colleagues are ready to respond. And Pam, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela and Eileen and my colleagues on the panel and all of you who've joined in for Union at Home. And I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion of pastoral imagination and Eileen's new book by that same title. I wanted to pick out one of those 50 chapters as a jumping off place for talking about an entree into this conversation that I feel both very drawn to as a core aspect of my pastoral ministry and as a core aspect of my work as a practical theologian / researcher in this project. And that is the chapter on listening. What I wanted to say about listening is that its centrality, both in pastoral ministry and in research, can be seen as self-evident, as obviously important, and almost like so obvious that one might overlook how complex it is, how difficult it is to do it all, let alone to do well. And there are a couple of reasons for that, and I want to just pause and think about the practice of listening as a component of what leads to pastoral imagination. And I think Eileen and I would both say that we try to employ pastoral imagination as researchers, as well as in our ministry. There's an aspect of our research project which is very much about the development of pastoral leaders over time. So we, from the beginning, intended the project to both be research and a space of communal development for the pastors we're following. And we've always interviewed them in group settings of five people from each of the seminaries, the 10 seminaries that we recruited participants from. So the first thing I would say about listening is that it's difficult because of me. Like, I get in the way of actually hearing another person. I think CPE, clinical pastoral education, is a key place in which a kind of learning to look at myself and the ways I get in the way of myself actually hearing another come to be articulated and present for me to learn from. But there are many other ways to do that. And one is working with the mentor who has a sense of the context of my listening and can say what they think of my evaluation of the space, what I've heard, and they can say what they see in the situation. I think in a traditional theological sense, I would say, like, the problem of sin blinds me, makes me focus on myself, like how I feel about what the other person says. And so I pay more attention to myself. And the danger there, I think, is that I can end up meeting myself in listening to another person and my reactions to what the other person looks like or says, or what their body posture is, rather than being aware enough of myself that I can hold that and in a sense bracket it or set it aside enough to open myself to really hearing them and listening deeply to them, and thereby opening a space in which they feel their space to be heard. So doing some work on myself, and I think that's especially complicated when you start to think about social identity. The fact that I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual male, all of those identity factors create blocks really for me in hearing others. And so the deeper work I can do about myself, my own social construction, and the ways I've been formed to see and understand the world can then help me in opening up space for me to see what work I have to do to actually hear another. And that's the second piece of listening that I think is so complex, is actually doing, in a way, background work to open up my own capacity to hear what the other is saying. So here's an example of that. We have a number of pastors in our study who are a part of the African Methodist Episcopal tradition. So just for starters, they're African Americans, and they're a part of a religious tradition, which is not my tradition. So there's already numerous sort of barriers I need to be aware of and try to figure out a way to acknowledge and make sense of in order to hear more rather than less of what they might say to me. Starting with the fact that I think both of the AME pastors in our study were pastors long before they went to seminary. So they've been in ministry actually for quite a while and then came to seminary. So even hearing the function of seminary in their ongoing pastoral formation and their development of pastoral imagination is different than how other people reflect on their experience. So it's on me as a listener, both I think in pastoral ministry and in research, to figure out what work do I need to do to learn about the life and context and formation of the other in order to be better rather than worse at hearing them, to hearing what they say, and acknowledging I'm not gonna probably hear them really well. And so check in with them, like, this is what I think I heard. Can you like feed back to me? Is this what you were trying to say? Am I hearing you right? So I feel like listening is one of those things that's crucial, but can be often overlooked as straightforward. And of course, I'm a good listener, you know. I went through seminary, I took pastoral care, I did CP, whatever, but I feel like it's actually a lifelong practice, opening myself up to a deeper capacity to be present in such a way that I can hear more and more fully and more truly what someone else wants to say. And by doing that, build trust so that they can say more. I think at the heart of our work in pastoral ministry and in this research project is building spaces that are more rather than less trustworthy, so that people can risk saying something that I might listen to. So that's what I wanted to drill down into a little bit as a way to open up some space for our conversation about learning pastoral imagination.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm mindful of how Eileen and Sue and I all teach listening very frequently, and excited to get your chapter for the next iteration of the pastoral and spiritual listening practicum that I teach, because I think it could be a great resource for them to see themselves in it. I think it's very accessible. So I would next like to introduce to you another dear colleague, Dr. Soo-Yeon Pak, who is the Dean of Integrative and Field-Based Education and Associate Professor at Union Theological Seminary. She's the co-author and co-editor of Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning. And she is the senior advisor to the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, which some of you may be aware of. Proud grandmother of Isabel, almost 3 years old, she is also a spiritual director, and she has come back to us from a sabbatical full of energy and ideas, and we're so excited to have you part of this evening. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Pam, for the introduction and for this opportunity to engage in this really foundational topic, right? The concept. I've been working with this concept for 13 years, and I'm just delighted to see 50 topics, right? And I can see all, in looking through the topics, I couldn't choose which because I use all of it in my class. So 13 years ago, when I came into this position, I was, I reshaped this field education at Union, the whole curriculum and the vision around this idea of pastoral imagination and pastoral intelligence. I have since moved toward moral imagination as a twin concept and value, and understanding in terms of field education and what people are doing in the field and in the context. As Kelly Brown Douglas said, it's about moral proximity. Like, we need to be in moral proximity with the learnings that we need to learn, and what we don't know, we need to be in moral proximity. And I understand the contextual learning as being in moral proximity. So I like to think about the field education. So I want to just talk broadly about the how this concept works in the program itself, the field education program, because it's is a way to creates a learning community that models and teaches students' way of doing, being, and thinking. And we talked about the embodied relational practice. And I talk about it's a moral imagination that integrates knowledge, skill, moral integrity, religious and spiritual traditions, religious and justice commitments in ministerial practice. It is, I believe, is at the heart of professional formation. And I like to believe, and I will say it to anyone who wants to listen, it's at the heart of the MDiv program. And I'll just put it at that, leave it at that. It's very important. It's a piece that pulls everything together. So as you know, students are placed in placements and in partnerships with learning communities outside, whether they are in churches, other agencies, religious and secular. Students learn to hone critical reflection on practice and theology. They learn models of ministry, examine social issues, and in doing so develop and be formed in professional identity and skills. And it's this, and I just want to speak to what Dijkstra also talks about, the kind of the four part of complex professional practice of understanding the sacred texts and learning to interpret it in its modern context. These are the elements that I kind of bring into the program. Developing an accurate sense of what makes human beings tick. This is where all the second religion piece that works on that, right? Possessing a complex understanding of how organizations work. We study organization, we try to understand how do we reframe organizations. And then finally, understanding the awareness of analytical understanding of the world, where we are, right? And these are all coming together. And I see these 50 and many more, I'm sure, ministry topics of pastoral imagination all feeding into that. And these chapters just beautifully illustrate some of these themes and what Dijkstra talks about, these four capacities that we are looking at when we're looking at pastoral imagination. So, and also all these things are put together in spiritual and faith practices. So as I engage this, and I've been working with this concept for now 13 years, I've been thinking a lot about, so what is it that we're doing? And in a certain sense, in this very modern, postmodern, capitalist, bottom line driven world, and perhaps theological education, this is a very ineffective way of teaching and learning. It's not efficient. It's very slow, and it just takes time. And it's not something that we can reproduce and produce very quickly. It can be costly because the kind of individualized attention that it requires for people to do their to get to be formed in the phronesis, or the wisdom, practical wisdom, it takes time. And this is, I want to talk about, it embraces what David Orr calls slow knowledge. And I want to really give a shout out for slow knowledge here. And it's a knowledge that leads to wisdom. It's community-based, it's shared, it's connected to the ecological and social contexts, right? It's not outside of the context. It is a heart-centered learning that leads to deeper understanding our humanness in relation to the living world. So I believe it leads to cultivating compassion. So this kind of the radical embodiment of these practices, all 50 and maybe more. I mean, I was just delighted. Apprenticeship is one of the chapters. Thinking theologically, it's like bread and butter of the work of field education. Theological reflection is, for action reflection, emotional intelligence, contemplative prayer. I mean, you name it. I'm just going down the list and say I can't pick one because they all are important and they show up in my in the field education program. So just a few thoughts about like moving forward, like what would I like to see and what do I struggle with in this work that I'm working with this pastoral imagination as a concept. I mean, Eileen, thank you for sharing this interreligious, that retreat of a rabbi and imam and I guess the pastor. It sounds like a beginning of a joke. And then you were talking about how do you form religious leaders in various different contexts of different religious traditions. I've been sort of struggling with that idea of if I'm sitting, my students who come from various different religious contexts are always, they're my teachers. They teach me, they challenge me to think differently about how I think about pastoral imagination. And I don't know that I quite have it yet, but I am working towards it. I'm not sure it always translates. And I'm not sure, sometimes I have to just say, no, let's leave that frame out and think about something else. So I struggle with that. So that's just something that I'm continuing to work on, that whether it translates across traditions and worldviews. I also want to sort of really ground all these the topics and the pastoral imagination in the context that we're living in this white supremacist within the systemic racism, patriarchy, and how does it show up differently when we really take those things seriously? So I always struggle and I always pay attention to that, right? How does the pastoral imagination or moral imagination offer vision and practice to challenge white supremacy and climate destruction that we're in right now? And I know you have the appendix and you have the questions for redemptive change at the end, which is very helpful. But I want to see that everywhere, like right throughout, not as an appendix, but I'm always like, this is, how do these practices hold up in anti-oppressive work? Those are the things that I constantly struggle with. And also, how do these concepts, this particular concept of pastoral imagination or moral imagination, shape and form our students around understanding issues of power, both structural and personal? The power issue is really important, and how my students are understanding how to really understand the social analysis of their field site. And Chris, you talked about the social location and listening, and how do we really listen and see what's happening in the field site? So that's the other piece. And finally, I just want to, the Auburn study on learning pastoral imagination has been really important in my work with the supervisors. In fact, 2019, I do supervisors, I gather supervisors twice a year. And your findings, I think there were 6 findings, learning pastoral imagination, and you have these paragraphs. I shared it with them. It's like, look, this is what you're doing. What do you think? And they were just really excited because like, wow, you put into words what we're trying to do, because it's almost sometimes intangible, almost ineffable. What am I doing? I mean, we can talk about how you supervise, but what is the actual learning that's happening? That's not always easy to articulate. And they found it to be so very helpful. So I want to thank you for that study. That's been really instrumental in my work with the students and my work with the supervisors. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. And now, last but by no means least, our newest faculty member, The Reverend Dr. Timothy Adkins-Jones is senior pastor of the historic Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, and assistant professor of homiletics at Union Theological Seminary. And Tim says that as a son of the Black church, he is deeply invested in its flourishing and in sharing the wisdom from this great faith tradition to those unfamiliar, particularly the wisdom and brilliance of Black preaching. His call often takes him outside the academy and the church to organize for a variety of issues in his community. So like others on this panel, he really embodies the categories of those publics, church, academy, and society, where we do all of our work in an integrative way. So happy to welcome this dynamic member of our community. He is also, by the way, the director of our brand new Religion and the Black Experience concentration in the MDiv program, and very involved in our justice, equity, and inclusion initiative that's happening and being put into practice in a new way this year. So welcome to Tim. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Pam, and certainly for the invitation to be on this distinguished panel. And Eileen, congratulations on your work with Christian as well for that kind of longitudinal study. Is invaluable and does not happen as frequently as I would love to. And so the gems of wisdom that come through both in the book and through the 3-Minute Ministry Mentor and through, I'm sure, other work that will continue to be revealed is so helpful, both as a professor and pastor, as I try to think about those two things together. One of the things that also, before I start, let me just say welcome to everyone, but certainly got to shout out some of the Bethany Baptist Church families that is in the house tonight. So I had to give some love to the church family so that they can give me some amens on Sunday. So I had to make sure I do that. But as I was reading this amazing book, I felt a peace, kind of moment of solidarity. Because as Eileen was finishing it, we were in the throes, the sort of early throes of the pandemic. And it reminded me of being in the throes of the pandemic and having to finish my dissertation. And so in trying to finish up my dissertation, there were things that I had to change literally because of what that new situation, what that unprecedented moment called for. I had to add almost a whole chapter that simply because we now found ourselves as preachers preaching to mostly empty sanctuaries, and had to adjust for that in a dissertation that was about call and response in the Black church experience. And so again, as I read through, certainly my eyes were drawn immediately to the chapters that were about preaching, but it really was chapter 4 about collaboration that really struck my interest. Because one of the things that I've seen over the course of this last season is that I found myself collaborating with folk I would have never dreamed of before. I mean, in trying to use and trying to develop pastoral imagination about how to manage in the midst of the pandemic, I found myself asking any and everybody about what they thought of would work, what might work. I mean, I'm having conferences with friends, non-clergy friends, non-Christians. I mean, I've bounced ideas off of everyone. And I can say in preaching now, I'm using pedagogical points from Instagram influencers, barbers, basketball coaches, comedians. And so imagination, not simply imagination, but as Eileen writes about imagination, as it is attained through collaboration, has literally been necessary in order for me to survive and to attempt to thrive in the midst of all of this. Pastoral imagination is an opening up for me. In fact, as one of my students said in class just this morning, and I'm quoting her now, that imagination allows you to discover meaning beyond what is seen and heard. And so this really is the task of those that are in academy, that those are in the church, and in preaching in particular, this need to cultivate imagination, pastoral imagination. It's not simply about being imaginative in your metaphors and your stories and in your delivery, But I think about it in the ways that we're able to connect with the congregation, connect with whoever it is that we are preaching with and for. Here is where I think pastoral imagination has some of its greatest import as a connector between people. Thus, why I think chapter 4 resonated with me so much, this notion of collaboration. I also love Thurman, and Thurman talks about imagination and disciplines of the spirit as a connector this way. In fact, he doesn't use the language of practice. That wasn't quite his language, but he describes imagination as a tool. And I think that fits within our practical theological parameters, really, for the definition of practice. He talks about imagination really as a practice. And I have to quote him here. It's one of my favorite Thurman quotes. He says that the imagination shows its greatest powers as the angelos of God and the miracle it creates when one person, I'm editing a bit, standing on their own ground is able while there to put themselves in another person's place. So for Thurman, pastoral imagination allows us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, allows us to collaborate with one another. And as Dr. Campbell Reed describes it, the practice of ministry will often be, I love this, a holy mess, but also a sacred drama that punctuates our lives with grace. And so again, as I've thought about collaborative pastoral imagination in the production of sermons and worship and the like, but also in the inclusion of members. One thing that I found so pastorally, I think this is true in the church, and I'll come back to the academy, but that when we were in the throes of the pandemic, we were in a triage kind of mode. We had to batten down the hatches, so to speak, go to skeleton crews, and you go from having, over 100 people, I go from over having dozens of people involved in the machinations of worship to now maybe 5 or 6, and even that was pushing the line at some of the throes of the pandemic. And so you go into this mode and you do what you have to survive, and people are grateful for it. But it does eliminate a lot of the participation. I'm thinking of worship now, a lot of the participation that other people in the congregation were used to. And I think that, and I know this, that when we were in the throes of the pandemic and everyone shut down, that was fine. That was appreciated. People accepted that. And we're grateful for the work that you all are doing, literally putting your lives in danger to make your way to the sanctuary, to be able to broadcast every week. But now, as we begin to transition back out of that kind of triage mode, obviously we're still very much in the pandemic, and we pray that the numbers will change and all those things. But as we do transition out and find ourselves opening up more and more, one of the greatest feedbacks actually I've gotten recently from parishioners is this real lament for the lack of collaboration, the lack of participation, their lack of feeling as though they are a part of what's going on. And I know that, speaking personally, that some of that is simply because we're transitioning, but also some of it is still due to just getting used to people being back in the sanctuary and people being around. And so that there is a kind of pastoral imaginative work that is necessary in coming back and then, in effect, reimagining what collaboration looks like. I have to go back though to the preaching, and this is one of the things that that in all of our preaching classes the last couple of years we've had to talk about, that when it comes to pastoral imagination, we used to have to imagine what people might be going through. We had to imagine what might be on their minds, but now we have to literally imagine the audience, right? Imagine the feedback, and it's this, and the only way you can become better at this is through the kind of action reflection work that Eileen talks about elsewhere in the book, actually for a few things, but specifically for preaching. I just love the notion of being able to practice something and then to be able to reflect back with it in community, and then to come back to that practice again with some new insights. And I think that over the course of this last couple of years, we've learned just the importance of that, because it's the only way that you can figure your way out in the darkness. What if you're being effective, if anyone is hearing anything, is by going through that practice of reflecting back on your practice and allowing that to be your guide. Certainly, you couldn't make it through without a lot of prayer either. Also, and so again, I think there are 4, because I know there's the preaching of Jesus chapter as well. But of those chapters that emphasize preaching, the notion of action reflection, the notion of in the notion of this action of prayer were really at the top of my list. And just I read them and I said amen throughout, because as I thought about really every sermon I preached, it really was on a wing and a prayer, thinking, wondering whether or not it was going to work. And so then finally, just thinking now through how we teach preaching with this idea of pastoral imagination, it really is it becomes a work of trying to cultivate imagination. I try now in each of my preaching courses to allow at least one of the sermon assignments to be supremely imaginative. My favorite this semester was I asked students in my preaching and protest class to imagine themselves in the civil rights movement, and then sort of the quote unquote heyday of the civil rights movement between 55 and 68, and to imagine themselves in a particular scenario, particular context, and then to preach a sermon to a congregation there. And I had some wonderful sermons. I had one student preach a eulogy for Emmett Till. I had a rabbi in my class this semester who imagined himself as one of the rabbis that wrote the letter that prompted King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And so he preached basically the Sabbath after King wrote the letter to Birmingham jail. And again, it was a very evocative sermon. But again, I think it's so important to try to create scenarios that really engage and force students to be able to imagine, because COVID was a kind of life-altering, world-altering event, but there will always be these changes in context. There will always be things that we cannot anticipate. There will always be circumstances we have no idea about how to deal with. And so the only way to prepare for that which we won't know is to cultivate our pastoral imagination, so that we'll have the tools to be able to modify and adjust as necessary. And so I'm greatly appreciative to the work, and certainly grateful for this conversation as well.
Thank you, Tim. It occurs to me that especially during COVID, with all of the losses and all of the challenges of clergy and lay leaders in congregations at that time, that cultivating imagination was one of the ways that we could overcome the sense of isolation and entrapment when everything was so locked down, that it gave us wings. So thank you for giving our students wings as well. So Eileen is going to give responses to the panelists now, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to put in the chat, I define pastoral imagination a couple of different times in the book, but here's one. For those of you who are like, how do you hone this down? There's one sort of tight definition. And because we're talking, it is a complex concept, and it has all these many layers, and it's an integrative concept, right? So we're bringing together so much: the embodied, the relational, the attention to power, as Sue was pointing out, the attention to the holy depths, we say, of every situation. How do we teach someone to see those holy depths? It's not an easy thing to do. You can only learn in practice. And it doesn't mean you don't do it in conversation with deep knowing or with study or reading. You do it with all of that, but you have to give it a try over time. So this, what you were saying right at the end, Tim, about how much things are open-ended, and I use the phrase from we use it in the study, Chris and I do, from our dear colleague and supporter to our project early on, Patricia Benner, who studied how nurses learn to become nurses. And she writes about clinical imagination. And she talks very helpfully about, in her books, about the open-ended and under-defined character of what we do. And what that means is you step into a moment, at the back of your sanctuary, or into your pulpit, or in the hospital room if you're a chaplain, or out into the streets if you're a protester and street chaplain, or whatever leadership you're in. You step into a moment, you don't know what's going to happen. You think you do. You have a kind of an idea. But the fact is, things will come at you that you couldn't anticipate. And the pandemic was like a gigantic version of open-ended and underdefined. We didn't know what was coming, and it's still coming. And now we're every day this week I've had conversations with people who are exhausted and overwhelmed and grieved, and they're not sure they're going to keep doing their work. And it's the ripple effects and the after effects of the initial losses we had in the pandemic and the ongoing chronic losses and the way it revealed so much racialized violence in our culture and in our healthcare system and in our churches. All of that just keeps coming. And so, absolutely, unless we cultivate a sense of imagination, pastoral imagination, practical wisdom, we don't know how to respond to people. We don't know what to do in that situation. And we have to just sometimes try, right? Just take the leap and then be responsible for what happens when we do it. And that is a very hard set of capacities to teach. And it can't be taught by saying, go read that book. We like to tell people, Chris and I do that when we interviewed people in that first round of interviews. And we asked them, where was your aha moment of learning? Almost none of them told us about a classroom. They almost all told us about clinical pastoral education, field education. That summer they worked at the camp. When they managed a bookstore, they told us about learning in practice. That's where their aha moments came. And that is where they come. I tried to locate it and I couldn't, my search wasn't working quickly enough to find it. Sue, I wanted to respond to your questions about, I write about in the book multiple places about the analysis of power. That's a regular topic I try to address because we see people living with those power dynamics, especially around gender, class, race, and other kinds of difference. So the people in our study are constantly navigating power, and we write stories to try to reveal what that work is like. But what I came to realize as I was finishing this book, as Tim put it so eloquently, in the pandemic, like that is where I finished this book. I got the contract on April Fool's Day of 2020. And I was like, didn't think it was coming because publishing was in trouble at that moment. And a lot of people were getting their contracts pulled or their books not accepted or, whatever. There was all kind of upheaval in the publishing industry. So I was a little surprised and shocked. I was trying to learn how to adjust everything in my life to online. There was so much going on. But as I wrote that book, and then things rolled out with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and the summer just every place was upside down and burning. The more I tried to write into that and speak about what pastoral imagination is and does, the more it became clear to me, and Chris and I have been working on this in different ways along these dozen years, but it really crystallized for me how much ministry, as it's conceived in the United States, is shaped completely by white supremacy. As a practice, ministry has been shaped and honed by it. Now, it's been easier for me because of my training and my experience to see how it's shaped by patriarchy. But what became more clear is how church life, ministry life, has been shaped as a practice of white supremacy. And even with the politics of respectability, other non-white communities of faith have adopted white practices that are built and designed to maintain white power. So this is the growing edge of our research, one of them, to further dig into how do we undo that? And what are people doing to undo it? And Chris might want to say more about his observations. The other thing we started into, and some things changed, 2019, we were in the process of doing some interfaith conversations alongside our pastoral imagination interviews. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to return to some of that at some point. But those questions are open. We talk about in our work family resemblances and resonance between the ways, this is the core is this way human beings learn as adults, and all the things we're talking about in Phronesis really have a lot to do with how adults learn a practice of any kind: chess, violin, cooking, riding a bike, ministry, medicine, law. There's a core of how we learn. That part, it it is different in every context and with each practice, but there's something about the keys to how we learn that's universal. And so how we talk to one another across and between and among people who have been shaped by different religious traditions is also another second edge of where our research is trying to go. And really, and truly, people are, so many people in the US right now and beyond, of course, but our research project is limited to the US context, are shaped by multiple religions. Very few people, actually, are only shaped by one religious tradition. And so we have people in our study who also have been shaped in multiple ways, and we're needing to figure out what that means. How do we uncover more of what's at work there? And again, that may be something Chris would like to say a little more about. There's a lot more I'd like to respond to, but I really would like to turn to questions if people have asked some questions in the chat that we should also maybe attend to.
Great. So the way we're going to do this is we invite you to raise your hand, your little hand in the Zoom at the bottom of your screen. If you look at reactions where there's a little smiley face, you can raise your hand. So that's one option, or you can put your question in the chat and Kevin will be helping me to identify those so we don't leave folks in the dust who are in the chat. So I actually think the first question we have comes from the chat.
Yeah, we have some questions. I feel like it's been a really robust chat, and some questions have already been answered by some of our panelists. So the first one I'll ask and bring out is from Easton Law, and they asked, is there a difference between, say, a theological imagination and a pastoral imagination?
We have thought about this some, and Chris, I'd love for you to jump in and say something if you'd like. I think about a theological imagination as being a way to think theologically within a number of different kinds of circumstances. And there are people, of course, who've written about theological imagination. And for instance, Willie James Jennings written about the Christian imagination. So I think of these as related concepts, but I think of pastoral imagination as particular to the context of leading in a religious context or community, and having that role of leadership. And so it is really a matter not of just a set of cognitive skills. And I don't know that theological imagination needs to be either, but it is really that whole sense of bringing everything you know about a moment and then responding with the best wisdom you can cobble together. I talk to my students about having a whole library to draw from internally. And thinking theologically is a part of that, as I see it. Of course, I've been studying this I'm going to put it in the pot that way. But somebody who spent more time thinking about theological imagination might want to say something different about it. Chris, do you want to respond to that?
I just would want to underscore what you said, and maybe just specifically say that I don't think a theological imagination necessarily assumes the kind of professional organizational leadership role that pastoral imagination does. A theological imagination could inform someone who's a lawyer, for example, or a nurse, or a potter. It wouldn't necessarily have that particular sort of leadership or ministry orientation that pastoral imagination has. But Craig Dykstra, when he talked about this concept, came to it through Eisner's book, The Educational Imagination. And he said, you know, there could be a sort of legal imagination that a lawyer is formed in. So he really thought of it as a concept that has lots of sort of family resemblances with other kinds of formation that leads someone to be able to have there was a question about Donald Schoen and his idea about the reflective practitioner. And there's very many ways of thinking about this kind of wisdom in practice. And I think pastoral imagination has a particular sensibility because of the complexity of the call of pastoral ministry in relationship to, a ministry context, whether it's in a hospital chaplaincy or a military chaplaincy, whether it's in a congregation or what have you. So that's, I guess, how I would think about that, Easton.
Do any of the other panelists want to respond before I go to the next question? Okay, from Jack Evert, did I pronounce your name correctly? John Dewey in Art as Experience gives a different perspective on imagination. Difficult read though. I am a potter, have been in spiritual care as therapist, chaplain, supervisory candidate. I would suggest identifying artists in the project on pastoral imagination. I would also look to clergy in conflicts or challenges. Dewey would say the imagination is a personal dynamic interacting with situation and material with which they work. As an artist called to ministry, one chaplaincy department felt I would not be a, quote, team player. I have done creative activities in ministry, but I felt I am an opportunist. Eckstein's clinical rhombus points out some contexts will be more supportive than others for training. Is it helpful to talk so broadly about imagination? Maybe some pastors, some contexts, and some challenges need to be identified. There's a lot there.
Yes. Well, I've been working on this for 45, 50 years and working on creating experiences out of which metaphors emerge. So the idea is, from my point of view, it's not just imagination, is what's the message? Just to give you one example, I worked with a Sunday school program. Pastor had Lou Gehrig's disease, and the Sunday school program was going down. And so I talked to the teachers and power brokers in the church and came up with the idea of jazz, because they wanted a steady beat of conservative readings and flexibility. And I didn't know this ahead of time, but the Boeing Jazz Band practiced in the church, and the church had never heard the band play. So for Rally Day, I had the band come and perform, and the kids had booths all the way around. So that's imagination, but it's based on listening. So you have to listen to the people who are invested, and you have to work with the material that's present. I just lucked out that the band was there, and it was the time that Burns had his special on jazz. So, to me, there's a context for this whole imagination, idea that is sobering. But it's like when you get that, to me, it's like a lightning bug. You get that light that goes off, then all of a sudden you have to look around, what are you working with, and things like that. So that's the only question I'm raising about the broad way that the material, the topic is being discussed, is that the thing about imagination is it's often a personal thing, and that can sometimes fly in conflict with a sense of community and ownership. I don't think it needs to, but I think it's good for people to be aware. So I'm sorry, I'm doing a lot of talking, but it's
let me respond to you,
topic.
Jack. You're
Sure.
really onto something here. We are never looking at the way people embody pastoral imagination outside of some context. They're always within the moment and the existing material and power and the spiritual presence. It's all grounded in the moment. It's not an esoteric idea. Now, this conversation might have led you to think that's what we were doing, but every chapter in the book, for instance, has at least one and sometimes two or three stories of the way people encountered their situation and then figured out what to respond to. What's tricky here is getting people to grasp that they're going to have to do that. So most of us who've been doing this work for a lot, we forgot what it's like to be new. And one of the things we want to do in this research and in the writing we do is remind people have to learn this. It doesn't just come fully formed. And one of the key, let me give you an example of one of the key things that has to shift is initially when people go into a situation, they're worried about how they're doing. Right, Sue? Go into field ed and they're like, how am I doing? Am I doing okay? Am I saying it right? Am I standing in the right place? Am I asking the right questions? Am I holding my hands the right way? I mean, they're asking a million. We did it. We all did it when we were new. But when someone's been in ministry for a little while, it's no longer the concern about how am I doing. It flips. And the question is, what is going on in this situation? And what is the kind of right response I need to make to it? Listening carefully, improvisation. We use the word salience a lot. That's a whole chapter. All things I'm naming are chapters in the book. Salience is knowing what to put in the foreground, what to put in the background. You can't learn that in 5 minutes. You got to do it for years to sometimes know what to pay attention to and what to ignore. So it's always grounded in a very concrete situation. Tim, I see your head shaking a lot. You got something you want to add in there?
Oh, well, those are just my amens. I mean, I think that is the kind of frenetic wisdom that comes over time is invaluable. And it makes me think, as you were speaking just now, it actually makes me think a lot about this question of theological education and what are our tasks. One thing that I hear often amongst pastors is sort of, again, a lament about the things that they don't learn, right? The things they don't learn that you're going to face in the life of pastoring. And one of those things as a topic, it tends to be around administration. I think that's a separate topic, but I think what it does is that for me, it further buttresses the idea that much of our task is to teach and to prepare imagination, right? To prepare for the ability to be able to adjust to what comes. And so the more we reflect on it, the more important it becomes to give and to try to train those kind of skills. Because again, I think that I don't know that it is commonly accepted that something like imagination can be taught, right? Or that building imagination is a thing that can happen. I think there's sometimes a sense that one either has imagination or they don't. Some similar to the ways that we often talk about art or artists, right? That either it is a kind of innate ability or it isn't. And I think that we're arguing, and certainly the book argues, that no, imagination in and of itself as a practice is something that can be taught, is something that we can grow in our ability to utilize.
It's a very particular kind of imagination. It's not imagination like, did you know how to draw a really colorful sky when you were 5 years old? Or it's not that kind of imagination. It's really about a habitus, Bourdieu would say, of how to be in the world. It's a way of thinking and acting that's embodies practical wisdom. And that's very different than just, can you think creatively about something? Can include that.
I think there's some parallels in the sense I did teach children a pottery class, and one time they were making cylinders, and I said, now you can, make it an animal. And so I saw this girl put a handle on one side and then on the other, and then she said, oh, if I can put a nose on there, it's an elephant. So she made me realize that she had to have a combination of skills to embody what her imagination brought. So one of the things that could happen in field ed is if a person has an idea, they may come back then to say, how do I embody? What skills do I need to embody the imagination or the vision I have for a setting? Because then you're looping back in, and then you're talking with other people. In terms of what you need going into it, I almost say it's a willingness to ask for help, to be a part of a community. But that's.
Well, thank you. Thank you for jumping in with your perspective, very unique perspective. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to jump to one that from Jason Whitehead. Hi, Jason. That's kind of meaty, and I think you'll find this an interesting one to tackle. So Jason, do you want to just read out your question, Jason?
Sure, I don't mind doing that. Sorry, I'm at home here in a little dinner time spot, so.
No worries.
Oh, good.
Well, so cognitive neuroscience, as I understand it, would describe imagination as the creative restructuring of previous experiences. That is, we can't imagine something apart from what we experience or what we learn, speaking really broadly about that. What practices, resources, and/or practical experiences would you encourage people to engage in order to broaden possibility in their own imaginations? That is, what cognitive bias puts us in places where we're in homogeneous spaces, so our imaginations immediately become limited to what that space is. So as practical theologians, what would you encourage pastors to do in order to create possibility in many ways? And then along with that, how should pastors, said very broadly here, help people within their contexts step beyond the nostalgia of their communal experiences to see memories as fodder for imagination rather than as fuel for seeking safety?
I wish
I'm not going to jump in the answer. I just want to know the answer. So please, someone answer this, because this would be. Please tell me.
We need Macrina Cooper-White to tell us about the neuroscience side of this.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts, but I'd love to hear from Sue on this one, and Chris is also ready to jump in. So.
Well, where do we start? This is a lot here. Let me tackle the last one first. So this is maybe not a direct response, but the connection between memory and imagination, right? I just want to kind of make the connection, and I think you do make that point. And I want to point to there are memories and there are memories, and I want to highlight dangerous memories, which is really connected to the imagination, right? So dangerous memory is not just a nostalgic memory of the past, but it is a memory that points you to the future. So there is a connection between the experiences and memories we have. So it is reclaiming, understanding, socially analyzing your memories and your history of your context in order that you are able to vision for the future. So I just want to, that's like Johannes Metz's concept of dangerous memory. So I just want to kind of lift that up as one way. And I found that to be a really profound way to connect, move from just the nostalgic piece to the future oriented or practice oriented imagination. Practices and resources. And again, this is about encounter, right? And this is why I talked about moral proximity that Kelly Brown Douglas talks about. It's really important. And how do we get that moral proximity? How do we get the proximity? What we learn in CPE, for example, is the proximity to suffering. You can't escape it. You're in a situation where people are dying and sick and distressed. You cannot escape that proximity. And what are ways that we are in? I mean, we are surrounded by that proximity all the time. And I would just, for me, I would ask ourselves, and I mean, I think this is also what Christian also brought up too, about listening, about looking around you. There's so much there, and we don't need to necessarily imagine something other. I mean, I think there's so much there if we just open our eyes and see and listen to what's happening. So, I mean, that may not be very helpful, but that's my initial thought about. And I think what's helpful about these 50 ministry topics is that they highlight those resources and practices toward imagination. And I think that's the whole purpose of this. I mean, I don't know if there's a whole purpose. I mean, that's one of the beauty of the book, is that the resource is here. This is going through these practices of engaging how do we redirect fear in learning goals? I love the way it's put it that way, right? So, and anyway, I'll stop here and others jump in.
Chris, did you want to say something on this topic? Go for it.
Yeah, let me pick up on the first part of the question. And what I wanted to say, Jason, about the cognitive neuroscience, first of all, is that in the sort of philosophical background of our project is especially the work of Hubert Dreyfus, who taught philosophy at UC Berkeley for many years. And he was a Heideggerian and thought if he uses the word imagination, which he doesn't really, but if he were to use it, he would mean more something along the lines of what Charles Taylor means when he uses the phrase social imaginary, which is not sort of like I thought up a creative thing, but more like the sort of subconscious sensibility that I have that helps me to cope with the world. Like I go to the door and I open it because I know what a door is and I know what a door handle is. And I know if I turn the door handle, the door opens. That's my sort of sensibility about how to cope with the ordinary circumstances of my life. And why do I know that? Because I was brought up and formed in my family and my social life to know that. And so Hubert Dreyfus developed this trajectory of human developmental learning that has to do with this: how does one learn to cope with the world around you, and not only cope with it, but actually be masterful in it. And he started out doing this thinking philosophically, but then over time, he got into, especially through his students, working with cognitive neuroscience and what came to be called embodied cognition, and the way in which the mind really isn't in the head, the mind is in the body. And so I think that's really a sort of background for the assumptions that we're making about what imagination is and how it functions and the way that one does what one does in the world. And one of the interesting things that they said in their studies of learning over time is that when you get to a certain point, you plateau in what you know, and you need to break open what you know by, he says, going to a different context or learning with a different mentor. And he cites particularly like studies of excellent violin players who intentionally move from mentor to mentor, and also excellent cooks who move from mentor to mentor to intentionally break open their learning from their plateau in what they thought was the right way to do it or what's excellent, and really like put themselves in a sense in a beginner position again, having to sort of break open their assumptions and learn new ways of doing that. Well, I think the same thing can happen in terms of ministry, or even of just the Christian life. Like, what does it mean for me as a faculty member to learn from students that we had from Madagascar, and for them to share with me how and why at the end of every service they have an exorcism, and what the Holy Spirit and other spirits mean to them in that context. And it then breaks open my sense of what I'm thinking about in terms of teaching Christian worship. So I think that's a really compelling framework to think about sort of how do we break with our common sense experience that we've gotten to so far to open ourselves up to having to really think hard. It's like my friend Pete Ward, who is learning and writing about bluegrass and religion, and he's excellent on the mandolin, but he decided to try and learn how to play the banjo. Now he's good on banjo, so that he's trying to learn the violin. And each angle of vision on bluegrass teaches him something entirely new about bluegrass. So that kind of, I think, challenging yourself to break open your learning is really crucial at a certain point.
We probably have time for a couple more questions, and there's one that I think, Chris, your comments lead us right into. So I'm going to grab this one off the chat. This is from, oops, where did it go? Oh, shoot. Nancy, maybe you want to read your own question. Nancy Lewis, or is it David Lawrence? I see two names here.
Yeah, I will.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, read your question out. It's really interesting.
So I'm still thinking about some of the things the various people were saying about the reflections on pastoral imagination needed to navigate the pandemic. So in our congregation in Michigan, we're returning to the sanctuary with masks on, many of us, still not all of us. We've still got 10 to 12 people every week who are coming in on Zoom, and some people are still not coming back at all. And that's creating a gap across which our people in our congregation really are having trouble just imagining what's on the other side. So I'm thinking about what you as pastors, as ministers, are doing for your congregation to help their pastoral imagination as we all learn to be a community again.
This is a challenge we're facing as well. I'm sorry, Alan. It's a challenge we're facing as well. And I found that it takes practice, right? It takes the kind of repetition of acknowledging that divide and then regularly going back to it. And what I found that it eventually then becomes the practice of the congregation to look and to expect. At this point, my congregation expects me when it's welcome time, for example, to offer again instructions for turning around, smiling behind your mask, waving a hand, but to also get on your phone, text somebody that's not here, for those in the chat to acknowledge someone that way, but to keep that divide front and center. We were talking a little earlier about salience, but to keep that divide as something that is recognized and to continue to speak to it and continue to try to develop practices for it has been something that has been helpful for us. I think the worst thing that and when I've said often to other pastors that while obviously I don't want to go back for all of the tragic reasons, it was in many ways much easier when things were strictly virtual, when we were in sort of a higher state of a divide. It just was easier to figure it out. This hybrid situation that we find ourselves in is a much greater challenge for us. So again, I think keeping that challenge up front has been helpful, and then just coming back to it.
I'd like to add a little something to that. Thank you so much, Tim, and for the question from Lawrence. I've just interviewed about 30 lay leaders in congregations over the last 2 months for a consulting work I'm doing with another seminary. And there's what you just said about the hybrid is actually harder than when we were just at a distance from each other is true, I think. What I notice, and I think is, and I'm going to tie it to some of what Chris was saying earlier, not only the Dreyfus brothers have we been in philosophical conversation with in the LPI project, but also situated cognition is a way of thinking that Sean Gallagher and others have taken up. And this idea that what we know is not just in our brains, but we know that's embedded and embodied. So we know what to do by what our body tells us, and we know what to, because it's learned and it's done it, and by the place we've been embedded. So our habits of being in the world. And one of the things the pandemic did that was most challenging, and so few people have actually written about it yet that I've seen, is that it totally disrupted all of our habits. And in every way about life, our habits were upended. So we ended up being somewhat, like Chris was saying, broken open to new habits. And just about the time we started getting used to some of those, it all shifted again. And the loss of knowing just with your body and your circumstances around you, how to move and what to do and how to act and how to be and how to say hello and greet people and all of those things is enormously disruptive to our sense of well-being and our emotional stability and our mental health. And that constant, what we call in our study, and I've got a whole chapter on called being pulled up short. You come to a situation and suddenly you don't know what to do. You're clueless about what just happened. And that's a moment of learning, but it's also exhausting to constantly be in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's where we've been for 20 months. And we're going to have to continue to be supportive to each other and continue to try to understand what we've actually experienced here, because it's bigger than anybody's fully captured yet in anything I've read. And it's not just ministers, of course, it's every part of life as we know it. So thank you for those questions that lift up how complex. This is knowing that we often just leave beneath the surface. We don't bring it up, but in the study, we're trying to articulate this subtle level of how one learns, because over time, that's what you need, is a more flexible kind of knowing, being, and doing pastoral imagination to lead well when people are suddenly thrust in every direction and unclear about what to do. That's why it's so important to cultivate this and give people a sense of, you're not at the end, you're at the beginning when they leave seminary. It's a real gift to them. If we can, addressing Shola's question, if we can give people a sense of, now you're on this trajectory and you're at the beginning and you've got a lot to learn. Put mentors into your life, put moments where you can reflect, put people who will talk with you about this learning journey and not just try to do it by yourself.
Yeah, I also just want to say our last question is a big one about theological education. And as a segue, I just want to throw in the thought that one of the first places, I think, where the recognition of the knowledge of the body came into play was as we began to learn more about trauma studies, and that there are knowledges in ourselves that are not just held in the cognitive realm, in the head. And that certainly comes up in theological education. I would wager that many clergy have trauma histories that are long before COVID ever happened. And we need to use this process of imagination. And I know Sue does this in her classes all the time. And the CPE movement does this all the time, which is to open up an awareness of all of those dimensions. Because if you're only operating out of here, or some rote learning about technique, that's techne, it's not phronesis. And we need to bring the whole person. But if we're afraid of what's in there, we can't bring that. So there's an awful lot of inner work and interpersonal work that has to happen in order to really break that open. So the last question is a really biggie. I would like to hear more about what is working or not with the cost of traditional theological education and Western European academic rigor. Does one of the 50 chapters address those two issues? I'm hearing this even as, is theological education as we know it a viable enterprise? And is it really training people for the kinds of imagination in ministry that you're working on, especially since you said that so many people said their aha learning didn't happen in the classroom?
The chapter that comes close, and this book, let's remember, I want to remind everybody here that the book I wrote was for the people who are in practice. It's not a book that's just to dig into the philosophical backgrounds, which we've been talking about, and I'm happy to talk about here. And anytime I'm happy to talk about them, but it's also really written in a way that it's most accessible to anybody who would pick up the book. But in the chapter called use of knowledge use, or use of knowledge, I get into this question about two things. We came to a realization as we were working through this project that we were really advocating for not just knowledge acquisition, which is what seminary's been about in a big way for 150 years, but also that we teach knowledge use. So it's not just that you know the history of the Black church or of the chaplaincy movement or whatever. You need to know what to do with that. and this embodied and relational and spiritual integrated knowing means you have to know what to do with those big pieces of acquisition of knowledge. Just learning it so you can have it as a catalog in your head is a very limited use. And so my subplot throughout my work as a teacher and as I write the various books is that I want theological education to be reformed. I don't want to give away all the knowledge. It's valuable, deep, incredibly valuable. But I want them to bring it together with knowledge use. What are we going to do with what you just learned? What are you going to do with what you just learned? So every assignment I give to students is integrative. And it's irritating sometimes to them because I'm asking them to think not just what they read in the book, but so what? What are they going to do with it? And I give them a situation to say, what difference does this knowledge make in this case study.
Mm-hmm.
Case-based learning is much harder and more complex than memorization or even certain kinds of integration that is just about putting two ideas together. That's important, valuable. I don't want to throw it out, but I really want people to think about knowledge use. And Chuck Foster, who was an advisor to us as well, said when he read some early things we were writing, y'all are really making a major challenge to theological education here, aren't you? And we said, yes, we are. And we're trying to live it and teach it and embody it and then get as many people talking to us about it so that we can all be moving in that direction. Because, yeah, just conveying more knowledge or information or even spiritual formation, it's not quite enough to actually prepare people for the work they're going to do. It needs to be, how do we use what we've learned? And how do we embody God's love? How do we enact forgiveness? How do we use the rituals of our faith to respond to a very challenging conflict? These are hard things to learn to do, but we need to give people a sense of imagining how, and then taking that risk, trying it, messing up, having a loop of feedback to help them get back on track. And sometimes there's a lot in the book about what happens when it doesn't go well.
Which we need.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. We are at time, and what an eloquent way, Eileen, to end this evening, and what the whole conversation has really been about. I thank all of you, Sue, Tim, Christian, and Eileen, and urge all of you to pick up the book and to check out the website. We'll leave the chat open a little bit longer, so if you need to scroll back and pick up some of those links, we'll let you do that. But we'll consider this to be the amen and the ashe and the thank you for our panelists. Join me in saying thank you to them.
Great to be with you all tonight. You can